I'm going to go back to suffering and atheism, if I may. So I was thinking about this before when we were chatting before we started. And have you ever heard of the writer C.S. Lewis?
Yes.
Okay, Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Okay, so he was an atheist, and he said that when he was an atheist, he would look at the world, the cold, hard world, and wonder how anybody could possibly believe in a good and loving God. Because the world is just full of so much nastiness. And he was surprised when people would look at the world. This was him in his atheist self. He was surprised when people would look at the world and think that there is good, that there could be a good and loving God. And yet many people do, whether, certainly taking it beyond the human relationality, right? And saying, but there seems to be something out there. And then with regard to suffering, then you get to this question of, okay, well, if there is this something out there that is superhuman, that takes us beyond ourselves, and for some reason, human beings have had this idea that there's this good and loving being, this intelligence, good and loving intelligence, then why does so much suffering happen, right? And Epicurus, like way back, I don't know if anybody was a classicist, I don't even know when Epicurus was alive, maybe, 300? Does that sound good? 300? Okay. Not that you would know, Tim, I don't know, I expect you to know these things, but, so Epicurus says, if God is loving or benevolent, why would God then allow all this stuff to happen? So then God must not be benevolent, but maybe God is powerful. But then if God is powerful, does God not have the ability, the power to stop this? So you end up with this problem of, okay, so many of us look at the world and think there's something out there that is bigger than me. So then why does all of this happen? And why so much suffering in the world? And so, I come from the Christian tradition, and there are a lot of sort of answers put forward to why a good and loving, a powerful and loving God would allow so much suffering. And the big three are, well, maybe suffering happens because it leads to our sort of development as human beings. And certainly, probably if all of us thought hard enough, we could think back to some point in our lives where something was really hard, where we did suffer, but we learned and grew through that. So you could say, okay, well, my 10 hardest years as a primary care doctor made me want to quit medicine at least twice a week. And yet the lessons I gleaned from that 10 really, really, really terrible hard years, are lessons I've taken forward that have changed me, but also I think honed me. So some people will say, well, that's an explanation. Maybe this good and loving, powerful God allows stuff to sort of refine us, make us wiser and better people. Maybe. I mean, then there's this question of whether God, if there is a God, allows suffering because of free will. Right, so if you think about designing, or you just think about a relationship, right? If you have a boyfriend or a girlfriend and you force them to love you, then that's not really a loving relationship. And so the idea here is that, well, maybe God allows all this stuff because while God could control it, some of the bad stuff that happens we bring on ourselves. The way we treat one another. And if God just wanted robots, God could design us as robots to do whatever God wants, but instead God gave human beings free will. So that's sort of another explanation. All of the pain that we inflict on one another is because we're sort of given the freedom to do that. And then there's this sort of third common explanation about why a loving and powerful God would allow so much suffering, and that's the kind of idea that there's a big gulf between the cosmos, between the intelligence of the universe and ourselves, right? So, You think about, you work in a hospital or a medical school. You're not privy to what the decisions the dean makes or the CEO makes, right? There's a gulf between you and the ultimate authority in any situation. And I'll say, these are common explanations. I think there's probably some validity to them on some level. But ultimately, I think none is wholly satisfying. And so we are left with the idea that, okay, well, if you're not an atheist and you do think there's some intelligence out there who could be good and powerful and loving, still suffering happens. And so then what do we do with it? And that kind of brings us back, right, to, whether it's what Martin Luther King Jr. said, Jeremiah the weeping prophet, you confront your anguish and you bear it, right? This is my suffering, I bear it. And I think certainly one of the threads we've touched on is the idea of needing to do that in relationship, right? Mm-hmm. So whether as physicians with our patients or as you go forward in training, the community that will help embrace you as you get on in your training, because you cannot go through medical training alone in isolation. You need to have a community of support. It's the only way to go on caring well for patients. But we bear our anguish and our suffering together. So I don't know that there's an ultimately satisfying answer.
Yeah.
I guess I'll just say one last piece from the Christian perspective, which is that there's we just came through last week was Holy Week, right? So the idea that in Christianity that God became human, right, in the form of Christ, and suffered this unbearable anguish, physical anguish, right, death on a cross, I think has, through the history of Christianity, given Christians a sense of solidarity in suffering with a God who knows what suffering is. And so maybe that's the strongest argument from Christianity, that God allowed God's self to come in the form of a human to suffer alongside and to suffer and die a human death, sort of the least dignified human death that there was at the time on a cross. Maybe that's the most reassuring thing for people from my tradition.
Yeah.